Thank you so much, Hunter, for taking the time and coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. Been looking forward to this conversation. I think, we don't have a ton of time today, so I don't want to go quite as deep into your story as I do sometimes with other guests, but would love if you could kind of lay the groundwork for people tuning in who may not be familiar with you and what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. I mean, I think it's a story of sort of two parts of a career, I guess. Right now, and for the last 8 years, I'm an investor. A former colleague and I started a fund called Homebrew in 2013. And that really came out of, well, first, he and I wanting to work together again. And second, realizing that we had always loved through our careers that the sort of years 0 to 5 of companies had always been the best, and maybe we could perpetually spend our time there by being early stage investors. Prior to that, I was at these types of companies, working mostly on the product side. Really, kind of three companies, 12 years here in the Valley. A virtual world called Second Life, and then I went over to Google, working on the early days of AdSense and then YouTube. And in some ways, the connective tissue between the three of those, you might think like, what does a virtual world, a contextual advertising product, and a social video site have in common? I've always been fascinated by the use of technology to help people be creative, for that creativity to occur in communities for both audience and collaboration. And then I think the platforms and the tools that help this creativity exist have an opportunity, maybe even an obligation, to think about the economics of creativity and help creators get paid if their creators so desire. I guess you can't pay rent or eat retweets and likes. So at some point, those have to turn into money if you're going to continue to make that stuff. So that's where we are today. I'm 47, a New Yorker who's been in the Bay Area for, I guess, 20 plus years, and so that makes me a local, if not a native.
Yeah, it sounds like you're coming up on half and half almost, even though you're a born East Coaster, I understand.
I know I have a daughter, and she's born out here. So when we bring her back east to see family and friends, we try to make sure that she knows how to fold a pizza slice and use a Metro card. I'd be very embarrassed if both of those weren't skills that she had developed during her early years.
Yeah, very, very important fundamental skills to teach your daughter for sure. I can kind of, sympathize a little bit. I've born on the East Coast myself and then spent just a couple years out in San Francisco after school. So got to see a little bit of both coasts, but still definitely much more of a majority East Coast guy. Speaking of East Coast, West Coast, and I want to dig into a bunch of cool aspects of your stories that you brought up. But before we get there, East Coast, West Coast, San Francisco, New York, a lot of people are leaving town, or at least the narrative is that a
Yeah.
lot of people are leaving each of them for places like Austin, Miami, even just LA, or you're hearing Nevada's making a push to bring some people in. What do you think of this whole concept that the ability of people to work remote is kind of leading to a exodus from some of these major cities, especially like San Francisco being a tech hub, and into some of these kind of secondary cities that may actually benefit from the whole thing?
Yeah, I think it's a great durable trend. If we can make sure that tech companies and tech employees can be spread, outside of just a few major hubs, I think it's great for the country. And I do believe some of this has been accelerated by, sort of the last year of the pandemic. I think it sort of forced us to run a bunch of experiments about, hey, what is it like if we're not all coming to the same office every day, as well as gave a bunch of people a chance to kind of reconsider what they wanted to prioritize. When you shake up the status quo and all of a sudden say, your employer is saying, hey, let's call the next year an experiment and you can work from wherever you want, like, especially if you don't have kids yet, which I think a lot of the people who've moved, are sort of pre-child or pre-marriage stuff. Like, why not? Why not go and do an adventure year and see what happens? And if you enjoy it and stay, all the better. And if you realize that there was something about New York or LA or the Bay Area that you really miss and you come back, fantastic. Like, I don't get the whole sort of tribal nature of people wanting to you know talk up or down one city or the other. Now, I do think the Bay Area in general, and I've been out here since '98. My wife's been out here since 95. I think they've kicked a bunch of questions down the road on, housing, development, cost of living, quality of life, that they can no longer take for granted. It's a wonderful, special, beautiful part of the world, but there's a bunch of trade-offs that come with living here that I think people were willing to make when the professional life was so anchored here. But if their professional life is not as anchored, I totally understand the desire to get more house for your money, or a public school system that you have a little bit more confidence in, or people who are trading sort of a very urban life for something that's a little bit more suburban or rural. So I think it's great. Frankly, it's the evolution of what you might consider, technology capitalism, where it's no longer, sort of sitting in just a few particular factories called, Silicon Valley and Manhattan, LA, and is spreading out further. I'm probably a little bit, and we can talk more about this if it's interesting, but I'm probably a little bit of a contrarian, I guess, in the sense of like, I don't think every company is going to be virtual and distributed. I think there's going to be sort of a multi-year kind of sort where some folks decide that they want offices, both companies and employees. Some folks decide they want hybrid, and some folks decide that they want fully remote. And more people may choose their next job based upon sort of that attribute than potentially sort of any other attribute of the company. So I think we're in for a few years of a lot of movement with regards to where people are and where they work.
So what aspects, if any, that you can kind of point out, that might be common threads for some of these companies in terms of defining whether they can be fully distributed, whether they need to have, a certain subset of employees come in 2-3 times a week, or whether they really need to be in the office every day, like 80% of the company or even 100% of the company? What do you think like will determine which bucket a certain company falls in, or is it, not bucketable enough? It more just depends
Yeah.
on like the individual company.
That's a great question. I think we're going to have a lot more science on that. Right now, I think it's anecdotal, right? And it probably has as much to do, frankly, with the beliefs of the executive suite than anything else, right? Like if you sort of look and you say, why does a Reed Hastings believe that Netflix is going to be back in offices? And, why does pick somebody else? Why does a Shopify, want to be more virtual? I think it has more to do with, what those founders believe than any particular specific nature of their business. And so I kind of think the C-suite or the founder is going to make that decision in the near term. I do think that the worst decision is something that's unintentional, right? So let's call it like unintentionally hybrid, unintentionally remote, which is sort of where you end up with different pockets of the way you work based upon, what a certain team wanted to do or the concessions you're making for one individual, without trying to make sure that you have infrastructure that is going to, provide the scaffolding, sort of around that. And what I mean is like, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily going to be cheaper by every stretch to be remote. I think you're going to have to focus on what type of technologies do you need to have in place to support collaboration. I think you're going to need to figure out, when do we as a company, or when do we allow teams to get together in person when working together in a confined space is what's needed to team build, is what's needed to solve a problem, is what's needed to pass a milestone. And so there's going to be all different types of cadences, I think, to some of the P&L items that I think today people assume get wiped away if you don't have people in an office together. And so, there'll probably be a little bit of, backlash, and then the backlash to the backlash, depending on whatever you chose. And then I think it's a personal decision at the employee level. Like, look, if I were in my 20s and starting my career, I'd really want to be in an office, at least in a hybrid situation. I'd want to be working alongside other really smart people. If I was an early stage company, I'd want exposure to how all these things work and how different people think. I'd want the serendipity of grabbing pizza one night, with a senior engineer that I didn't know, all these types of things that I think you lose a little bit when you're moving to fully online. So I think there's going to be both, supply and demand for all types of configurations.
Yeah, so let's touch on serendipity a little bit because I think it's a really interesting concept. I actually spoke about it recently. I had Eli Gill on the show, and
Hmm.
he launched a new, Pluto.video, I think it's called. It's like a VR world, and obviously you have some experience from doing
Yeah.
Second Life and creating that something that's, maybe not exactly the same or even remotely the same, but somewhat similar in that it's like a virtual world. What do you think? And this is basically what I asked Eli. Curious to hear your perspective as well. What do you think of the, potential for creating online serendipity? So there's obviously Twitter already and things like that where you can kind of, people can message and comment and retweet and everything like that or do DMs. But in a virtual world where you can actually kind of move around and like navigate and like meet people in something that aligns closer to like the physical world in terms of like a setting and an environment, do you think that we may one day get to a place where that's actually a reasonably close alternative to what can, happen in real life with meeting
Yeah.
someone in the office or something like that?
I think there's different, I think bringing things online, always sort of has some benefits and some cost, right? So like, oh, matching, like, matching is easier in terms of if, when you know everything about, you put a bunch of people in a physical space, you don't know who's there, you don't know who should be talking to whom, the serendipity of that. When you put people in a virtual space, the algorithm has much more information to, give you context, provide those matches. Like there's always trade-offs. But I generally believe that we're going to see at first kind of replications and then evolution and extension of some of the behaviors that we think of as being physical world spaces into the virtual. We have at least two investments in areas that I'd throw under that umbrella. One is called branch.gg, and it's a virtual workspace that feels more like persistent workspaces from people who grew up, doing Minecraft, rather than somebody who's trying to create a, photorealistic simulation of your office environment. And it has all forms of, spatial audio. So it has persistence, it has very simplistic avatar representations, a bunch of things. And two very young founders and a smart team. And for us, that investment was basically probably very similar to sort of the stuff Elad's working on. Is just saying that like there's going to be spaces of persistent congregation that aren't just about virtual events, but are about sort of virtual tribes and the space that tribe needs. Another one called icebreaker.video that's really about the idea that some of those online video interactions aren't going to all take place in Zoom. That like once you build a tool that has um, uh, let's even call it like emotional baggage, right? That like this is what I click open to do, meetings, to do sales pitches, to do a very certain type of function. That people are going to want alternate spaces that are optimized for things that look and feel different. So my belief is that like um, uh, when you take platforms like Zoom or Slack, so on and so forth, that they're not going to turn into Swiss Army knives. That's to say, like every tool you need that either involves, text or video won't just be bundled into those. There's certainly going to be things, applications that live on top that make a lot of sense. But I also think taking separate spaces and dedicating them to um, uh, types of interactions that you just can't get when you're trying to use the multi-purpose tool is a good bet. Like for every winner that has very enterprise, very gray, very structured feature sets, there's going to be a sort of mirror world winner that's more playful, more fun, that you just feel good using. And so I guess we're investing in some of those mirror world types of virtual collaboration experiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, kind of the unbundling of Zoom. And I think Zoom for me personally, I haven't, I've used it. We're using it now for the podcast and it's actually great for that, using it audio only. But, having not been like working for a company, like being employed the last year, I haven't actually used Zoom as much as some people who describe like the
Mhm.
fatigue and whatnot. But it seems to me that it's just super, not ideal at all for a lot of use cases, especially like, I got together with some friends from college or whatever. And it's like, I don't need to use Zoom where like we can all see one person projecting at a time and everything like
Yep.
that. I'd much rather get together in something like what you described. I think it was called Branch, where you can kind of meet up and everyone can go have spatial audio. I can go have a conversation with people over here. They can have separate people can have a conversation over there. And then even on the video side, the things that do require more of like a Zoom-esque type of thing, there's probably a bunch of use cases that can be split out as well. So I think that that definitely makes a lot of sense. And everyone kind of defaulted to Zoom overnight. But as we get more comfortable with kind of this new look world, and even if it goes back a bit to more in office work, I think there's plenty of room for a lot of different providers. So it sounds like a really interesting strategy. Going back to Second Life, that was 2003, I believe that you helped lead that. What
They started in late 2000. I joined in early 2001, and believe it or not, the company just finally sold Q4 of last year. So I had almost 20 years since I started there before they had my startup journey, so to speak, ended.
I saw that as a little surprise drop in the bucket, huh?
I know, right? It's that's why it's everyone gets no matter what you're doing, get your ownership.
So I'd like to hear about one of your early experiences, and then I do want to talk about YouTube a little bit. But whether you want to kind of tell the story behind Second Life a little bit, or before that, I did dig into your past. I saw you worked on the
Uh-oh.
Conan show. Were you
That's
expecting
true.
that?
And it's true. Well, sometimes. Look, basically so the second season of Conan O'Brien, I worked as like an intern on the research team. I kind of did my 40-hour weeks over the course of three days while I was spending the other 2 days on my college campus, finishing up my senior year of being a history major. And basically, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about loving the aspect of creativity and I was always kind of one of the nerd, newspaper editors and high school, college type of stuff. And I had actually started doing a cable access TV show while I was an undergrad, and I was like, this is so much fun. I wonder what the real thing is like. And that's what ended up bringing me down to Conan. There's definitely like alternative lives of Hunter Walk where I stay on Conan or uh, never come out to the Bay Area. And man, I don't know. Sometimes I mean, obviously, I love everything I've done, but I think that life could have been equally interesting. And so, I've never been kind of a long-term career planner. I've just tried to make decisions about what feels right. Second Life, I got introduced to the founder, Philip Rosedale, via a mutual friend, a mutual acquaintance. And they were building kind of The Sims on steroids, I guess. And I remember just sort of visiting them, spending some time there, and just thinking like, these are some of the smartest people I've ever met trying to do something really weird, and it feels like I belong. And I'd come out of grad school sort of saying, well, okay, I don't know what I want to do, but I have 3 rules for how I'm going to decide. The first is I only want to work on projects that I'd put on my tombstone, right? So like what I'm working on has to really reflect kind of part of who I am. It's not just a job. It's something that I feel like represents my time here on Earth. Second is I want to be there during periods of time where I feel like I can make a real difference, right? So not just ride a curve, but like maybe actually have a chance to impact the curve. And third, I want to work around, I want to learn from who I'm doing it with, not just what I'm doing. I want to work around really smart, ethical people. And that one just checked off all 3 boxes. So I kind of joined and got a chance to be the first non-engineer on the team, and left a few years later, shortly after kind of commercial launch. And that was my transition, but then sort of led me over to Google in 2003.
Yeah, I like that framework for decision making, especially like the tombstone project concept. I've never heard
Yeah, it
it
always
said.
feels kind of morbid, right? I'm like, would you put this on your tombstone? I'm like, but in many years, and and not to the exclusion of other things, right? So I'm not saying some of the things that people normally put on tombstone, right? Like father, husband, friend, all those things, not to the exclusion of those. But I don't know. I've never been able to fully agree with the idea that like your work isn't who you are. I'm like, your work is a big part of who you are. And so I've tried to always be as best I can, and it's a privilege to do so. But I think it's also, intentional, that the things that I work on like are representative of the things I care about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think some people separate work and life and like they work so that they can live, but kind of combining the two and making the line a
Yeah.
little bit blurry. I think for me
Yeah.
personally, that's the preference as well. So, that decision making framework brought you to Google in 2003, very early, obviously pre YouTube, and then you helped
Yeah.
basically make YouTube when it joined Google through the acquisition. A lot of people thought YouTube was going to fail, right?
Yeah. I
So
mean,
So
It was
like
only
what?
18 months. It got acquired after about 18 months. It was this rocket ship, proverbially. But people don't remember now, but like the acquisition was kind of scoffed at because one, it was, a pretty pricey acquisition for the time. It's called like 1.4, $1.5 billion. And second, people sort of said, well, how, it's dogs on skateboards, right? Like they were making fun of the user generated content, and or there were a bunch of lawsuits. Like it was the question was still open, not in Google's mind. They obviously did the work ahead of the acquisition, but people who didn't fully understand kind of safe harbor and the DMCA, wondered how fan uploaded content, what YouTube would ultimately do about that. And I think what they were able to do about that was, turn it in, give rights owners the ability to turn fan uploaded content into something that is productive for them if they so desire. Monetize on behalf of the rights owner, so on and so forth, or to take it down if it's not. And it really took. I think the YouTube team deserves an incredible amount of credit for sort of figuring out how to build what they did. And then sort of, the founders of YouTube will sort of say like Google was the best late stage VC for them in the sense of being able to help scale out the technology, help build the rights management, really be a good home for that company to sort of reach, some pretty impressive scale. And I was just lucky enough to be there, during kind of the post acquisition period. Some of it was just steady hand on the wheel, right? Like not screwing up. But I think some of the good stuff that happened, during my tenure, we bet on mobile very, very early, which of course now sounds like a no-brainer. But at the time, pre-iPhone and stuff like that, it wasn't clear yet that mobile video was going to be a thing. And we sort of decided that for a variety of reasons it was, and we wanted the YouTube of mobile to be YouTube. And so we made a few, I think, smart bets on the product, some good biz development deals, stuff like that. I'm proud of what it became, and just, blown away by what the people after me have been able to build.
So then I think you met your partner Satya back
Yes.
then at Google. What, years later made you guys decide to start this VC fund?
Yeah, so we worked together. He'd gotten there a little bit earlier in 03, and I got there in the second half of the year. And we worked together on AdSense for about three and a half years. And beginning of 07 was when he decided to leave and go back to venture for a while. He had done venture prior to Google. And I went over to YouTube, and we sort of knew that we were certainly going to remain friends. But there was always this aspect that we kind of felt like at some point, maybe we should do something together. I think we just had a real respect for both our similarities and our differences. And for a while, that kind of meant him trying to, hey, come start a company. You can be an EIR at this venture fund. But I was really enjoying YouTube. Then he went over to run product at Twitter. I've always been, very interested in the, opportunities and challenges of that product. But, by the time he was there, it wasn't the right place for me. And it wasn't until second half of 2012 where I was thinking about leaving Google and he had left Twitter, where we had a blank sheet of paper. And that's what finally allowed us to decide, what we wanted to do together versus one of us just trying to recruit the other one.
Right. So last question here, and then I'll give you time to point people to where they can follow you and everything like that. But you talk on your website about how, the focus, your singular focus, I think, as a fund is to help, and excuse me if I'm misquoting a little bit, but basically to help companies, create a team and a company that they're proud of, and that the
Mm-hmm.
financial outcome and everything else will kind of take care of itself. It reminds me a lot. I'm reading a book right now about John Wooden, and he basically talks about how you want to focus on like, maximum effort and
Yep.
maximizing your potential, and you don't have to worry about the competition. Everything else will take care of itself. How do you actually go about kind of putting the blinders on to some of the financial metrics that a lot of teams kind of, go by night and day, and focusing internally on building a team that you're proud of?
Yeah. I sort of think about it like if our job needs to be to understand whether the problem the entrepreneurs are telling us they want to solve is a valuable problem. If they achieve what they're trying to do, is, by design, that company going to be incredibly valuable? And do the founders have, let's call it, the combination of attitude and aptitude to want to solve it fully? along the way, the valuation, the financings are kind of just uh, anywhere at best, kind of important, necessary milestones, and at worst, sort of arbitrary, statements of, what somebody else is willing to pay for a share in this company, at a point way before we still, still way before we know what it's actually worth. And so what we try to do during the period we're most involved with, which is kind of the seed to Series B, from seed to A, we're trying to help them really build a foundation and not just sort of will themselves into a growth curve that they can fundraise off of, but figure out from a product, distribution team standpoint, who they are, and then, what have they been able to prove so that the next set of investors, believe that they are buying into a company that fundamentally is going to have the chance to be, worth multiples more, a few years from now. And then from A to B, what we kind of do is, okay, you've gotten, now it's time to actually scale what you figured out how to do. And by the time they reach the Series B, we hope, which is usually, we're obviously longtime investors, we help them beyond that, but like that's usually where we quote unquote like step off the board. We've tried to accomplish two things: that their fundamental sort of like core business is performing well enough that even if they just continue extending that at the same growth rate, they're going to be a phenomenal company. But that they have sort of a quote unquote next act that they're still willing to sort of re-risk the company for, right? So they're not just 5 years in kind of willing to coast on their growth rate, but that they're founders who have sort of a gleam in their eye that say, okay, now we're ready to do the really crazy thing. And I think that's worked well for us so far. I mean, we've been fortunate enough to invest in some companies that, 7-8 years in look like, they're going to, achieve as much or more than the founders had hoped. Companies like Plaid and Chime in the fintech space, Gusto in the SaaS space, a company called Bowery Farming in the indoor agriculture space, amongst others. And, they all sort of started out with just that notion, like, the way the founders define the problem they want to solve, if they can do that, do we think that's do we think that's fundamentally a valuable company? And do we believe in the founders and their ability to, build the company that will solve that problem, and to keep on pressing and keep on taking the risks to do so? If you have that, I think you have a lot of the components of a very successful investment.
Great. Yeah. I know, we talked about some of your work with some of the products like YouTube, and then you just made my job easy rattling off some of the best investments. But obviously, you guys are doing a great job with the fund so far, and look forward to following, along and seeing. I'm sure there's a bunch of companies in the portfolio that'll kind of shine as the future unfolds. For those following along and want to, continue and watch some of these, watch some of your successes unfold, where can they follow you on Twitter and, learn more about Homebrew or some of your investments and things like that?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm pretty easy to find. Homebrew is at www.homebrew.co, HOMEBREW, of course. And hunterwalk.com is where I mostly blog. And then on almost any social service, Twitter included, if you just go to a username hunterwalk, it's likely me. It's one of the benefits of having a relatively distinct combination of first name and last name. And so long as I got there somewhere within, I don't know what, first 1,000 signups or something, like not a whole lot of people fighting over that username.
Awesome. That makes it easy enough. Well, thank you very much, Hunter, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Look forward to connecting with folks from here, and hopefully coming back on again at some point and continuing the conversation.